Area, our good friend Billy Liucci rejoining us after a while. Billy, thanks for the time. And man, a couple of months ago, we were wondering whether Jimbo could ever get it right, and now we're wondering whether they'll sneak into the playoffs. So, what's going on out there?
Wild ride these last few weeks, Paul. Like you said, a few weeks ago we talked. They had lost, yet another game to Alabama. It was another loss to a team ranked one or two. I think right now Jimbo is 23-4 since he's been at A&M on teams not ranked one or two. So I think the key was to play like a top five Florida team and not a first or second ranked. That seemed to be the tonic, and ever since then, there was a lot of talk this weekend about A&M not being convincing enough, which I found a little interesting. A&M's last four SEC games, they've been up 42-17, 28-7, 34-0, and Saturday night 20-0 through three quarters. So to put four SEC teams completely away in a row by the end of the third quarter and have that win over Florida. Yeah, they didn't look good on offense Saturday night, but they looked great on defense, and they'd been rolling along offensively. We'll see if they can get it back together. That'll be the whole key, because they got to get it together in a hurry to go out there at Auburn. This will be the biggest game of the season since that showdown with the Gators.
And this has been such a bizarre series. Last year, it just seemed like A&M just threw up all over Kyle Field. We've seen some bizarre games. How much of last year do you think still sticks in the craw of the Aggies? Because that was a painful loss.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that was one of the games that wasn't against one of those top two. Last year with A&M, we talked about it a lot. Starting one senior, I didn't feel like they were quite ready to win those games against one or two. But Auburn was 7-8. They didn't finish that high. I'd say that was A&M's worst game of the season, with the exception of that LSU loss in the finale. So they have a lot to prove this year. And don't forget, the last time they went up to Auburn, Paul, they lost that game. They lost that game. They were up 10 with about 5 minutes left and gave up back-to-back touchdown drives to Jarrett Stidham of 75 yards and lost that thing. And Ryan McCullum, the Aggie starting center, talked about that today. That's one that has not set very well with them.
Let's talk about the playoffs, and it just seems like a narrow path. And assuming the Aggies hold serve, what are you hearing in terms of what needs to happen to get them in?
I think a lot's going to be made of this beauty pageant thing. Now, I saw it this weekend. People were conveniently leaving out that Notre Dame beat North Carolina by the same margin A&M beat LSU. It just was a little more offense. They beat Louisville 12-7. So we're going to start doing that thing, I guess, the rest of the way if A&M can keep winning. But I think that's the toughest part for the Aggies. Win at Auburn, outscore Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss the following week, and then go out to Tennessee for what certainly, feels like a trap type game if A&M's got everything to play for and Tennessee has nothing to lose. So those last three will be tough, but win those. And Paul, I mean, I would have said it's as simple as what happens in Notre Dame-Clemson. If Notre Dame beats Clemson, two-loss Clemson, A&M's probably in. If Clemson blows out Notre Dame, I think A&M would be in, because I think people would say, hey, Notre Dame wouldn't have won that game had Trevor Lawrence played. That much is obvious. But now you've got this Big Ten factor, and I heard you talking with Pat earlier. That's really getting interesting now, because what if you have a 9-1 A&M versus a 5-0 Ohio State, or what if it's a 9-1 A&M versus a Northwestern one-loss Big Ten champ? So A&M all of a sudden had this other weird kind of window open up if they can get to the finish line with three wins here down the stretch. So they're kind of just hovering and on the periphery here, but they're right on the edge. I mean, I think people don't realize A&M has to move up one spot, and the only team that looks like they're likely to pass the Aggies if they keep winning would be the only team that would do that would be Florida, and then if they lost to Alabama, they'd fall right back behind the Aggies. So A&M's in a very good spot. Again, I think the toughest part will be winning out themselves.
talking to Billy Liucci about A&M's path to the playoff. Billy, I normally spend most of our time talking about the Aggies, but during the conversation with Pat Forty, we talked about the situation, oh, I don't know, about 100 miles from you. That, I mean, it's just amazing that we're having a conversation about Tom Herman's future, because I remember when he was going to save the world, let alone the University of Texas football program. Give us the view from Bryan, Texas.
Yeah, you know what? I remember I was talking about the other day. I remember sitting in Kyle Field when the reports were getting out that Tom Herman was taking over LSU, and Ed O was just trying to finish off as the interim and ended up beating the brakes off the Aggies. And it's funny how all this has kind of turned. But if you're looking at it from A&M's standpoint, I'll be honest with you, you want Tom Herman to stay in Austin. It's not to say they're going to go out and get a slam dunk hire. I know everyone thinks that they're a slam dunk to get Urban. That's far from a sure thing. But Tom Herman would go into this recruiting cycle. I mean, I think as a dead man walking going into next season, it would be very difficult for him to recruit at a level that would scare an A&M team that has it going like they do right now. I think the most interesting thing about this past weekend is not whether or not A&M gets jumped by Florida in the rankings, or whether how good their offense looked or didn't look, obviously against LSU. I think the big thing that happened this weekend is the Aggies went 2-1 against LSU under Jimbo Fisher, who's the coach that everyone in Baton Rouge wanted before a year ago at this time, and had the school that had owned A&M for their first 6 years in the SEC. But he's 2-1 against LSU. LSU's got a lot going on off the field right now in multiple areas. They may very well finish 3-7 if you look at that schedule. And on the same weekend, Tom Herman loses at home to Iowa State, and the buzzards and vultures are circling down there at the state capitol. So that's a huge swing weekend for Jimbo Fisher and Texas A&M this past weekend. If you're talking about not the immediate future, which is this year's playoff race and Auburn coming up, but just the next couple years. And Jimbo's put together, I think, the number 3 and number 6 class back to back. And then you add that momentum while a couple of your recruiting rivals are staggering. Just circle that weekend. And if we look back on it, if A&M ever rises to really accomplish great things under Jimbo, you could look back at Friday and Saturday as kind of a pivotal moment for the program.
Yeah, you're talking about fierce recruiting rivals, and yeah, we get hung up on Tom Herman, but it's worth remembering the year before Jimbo Fisher had the LSU job, and then the now famous Joe Oliva started getting tight with the pocketbook, and Jimbo and his agent Jimmy Sexton said, "We'll see you later, pal."
Paul, I was in the stadium. Again, you go back to A&M LSU. It's been a very interesting rivalry over the years. 2 years ago, 7 overtimes. Last year, 50-7. Joe Burrow's senior night, and then that year you're talking about. I was in the stadium when the LSU fans gave Les Miles his fond farewell, and he tipped his hat to the crowd and before the game. And by halftime, you start hearing that there was going to be no Jimbo deal, and he did what LSU used to do every year, which is beat A&M, and he had a job for at least another, I guess, 4 games or so before that last second loss at Auburn.
So true. No, it's amazing the interplay between Tom Herman and Jimbo Fisher now, at least in Texas. So are you calling your UT buddies? Are you offering money to anything to keep Tom Herman in the state? And by the way, if he stays, what is the recruiting going to look like?
They're not doing a really good job on the recruiting front right now. And I've covered A&M and recruiting in this state for longer than I care to admit, literally a quarter century now. I remember the days of Leonard Davis, and I remember lobbying for A&M to take Drew Brees and not let him get out of state. But so this goes back a long time. Texas is a very easy job to recruit to. So if you're having trouble doing it, it's not a good sign. It's not a good sign. And A&M had a couple years where You always look. They're not rivals anymore on the field, but A&M is still a big time recruiting rival with Texas and Oklahoma. They all fight for the same guys. You've seen the pendulum swing since Jimbo arrived, and you could kind of see that happening. Texas loses a lot of battles to Oklahoma, and they complained a lot when A&M. They didn't want A&M to go to the SEC because they thought it was going to open doors for the conference in the state, and it absolutely has. LSU's always done that, but you look at Alabama, and they're getting a couple of Longhorn legacies, and the Brockermeyer twins. Those are recruitments that you just can't lose. They had the #1 quarterback in the country. Of course, A&M would have loved to have gotten him too. Don't get me wrong. He's a Texas kid, class of 22, but he's going to Ohio State. They had an elite receiver leave to go to Ohio State a couple of years ago, and Garrett Wilson from right there in Austin. And that's what kind of got that whole Zach Smith, Tom Herman, Urban Meyer deal going. So I have to imagine Urban sitting back watching this, whether he has any intention of going there or not. And I can't imagine that this isn't in some way enjoyable for him to watch. I know it's enjoyable for Aggies right now, but I'll be honest with you. You don't get the pettiness and stuff like that from the A&M players or coaches. Not with this. Not with there was no like revenge factor against LSU. They're not talking about payback against Auburn. I do like where Jimbo's got his team mentally right now. I really do. And the fact that they kind of came out sluggish, Paul, really sluggish on offense after those 3 weeks off, and a bunch of those guys didn't practice for 2 weeks. I think it gives Jimbo a lot of, let's call it coaching ammo this week leading into Auburn.
Final thought here, Billy. 7 years ago, right now, Texas thought they were going to hire Nick Saban. Now they think they're going to hire Urban Meyer. I mean, would someone tell Texas that they're no longer Texas, and guys like that aren't really wowed by the University of Texas and Bevo?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think the most interesting thing, Paul, would have been if had USC played enough games for that job to get interesting. And USC and Texas and maybe even Michigan opened up in the same year. That would have been absolutely wild. But yeah, they do have an inflated sense. Paul, they'll still tell you that they had Nick Saban. You cannot tell them otherwise. And those are the same people that laughed themselves out of their chair when you would merely suggest that A&M was going to get Jimbo Fisher. So I think A&M hiring Jimbo and it working out like it has thus far is it's really ramped up the pressure in Austin, along with consistently losing to Oklahoma like they have. So they're probably going to back up a Brinks truck. And if they make a move on Tom Herman in this pandemic environment, and again, I heard what Pat said, he's spot on, obviously, in this climate, that type of financial commitment to go and make that change, if you don't get Urban and you're getting someone that might be slightly better than I don't know who they go get at this point. So Texas fans will tell you there's no way. I do think there's some sort of world we live in where he might be back. It didn't seem like it today when I tuned into that Longhorn Network and watched his press conference, but who am I to know? You're just teeing me up, Paul. Y'all are getting these little Twitter sound bites that I'm gonna have to deal with the rest of the day. But I love it.
Anything we can do to help your stature in Austin, Billy, we will. Hey, thank you, Billy. Great to have you on.